evening, and welcome to this special segment of Cracking the Khrushchev Code. I'm your host, Julia Kaufman. Nikita Khrushchev became the Communist Party secretary in 1953 and premier of the Soviet Union in 1956. On tonight's segment, we will discuss three of the main events of the Khrushchev era: the Suez and Hungary crisis in 1956 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. But first, I'd like to point out a key feature of Khrushchev's philosophy. He made his famous secret speech in February 1956. In it, he surprised the world by making a huge departure from Stalinist policies. He denounced Stalin and even addressed the purges of the 1930s as crimes against social justice. While the speech seemed like it would have a positive outcome, at least to the democratic world, it opened the door for criticism of the Soviet Union in the inner Communist Party circles. And now on to the Suez Canal crisis. On October 29, 1956, Israeli armed forces were pushed into Egypt and toward the Suez Canal. This was 4 months after the nationalization of the canal by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser gave himself the title of dictator and was also a strong spokesman for Arab nationalism. During the time of the breakout of war between Egypt and Israel, the Soviet Union was providing arms to Egypt. Israel sided with Britain and France for protection. The two Western powers wanted to regain control of the area, especially if the Soviet Union was influencing the new dictator of Egypt. Nikita Khrushchev threatened to shower Western Europe with nuclear missiles if the Israeli-British-French alliance did not withdraw. American President Dwight Eisenhower sent a warning to Khrushchev and encouraged him to refrain from intervening. Eisenhower also issued warnings to the Western and Israeli alliance, threatening them with economic sanctions if the attacks continued. The British and French, severely weakened by the whole crisis, withdrew their forces in December 1956. Khrushchev's influence remained in the Middle East. The crisis also gave him more freedom to move about in his sphere of influence. One success for the Soviet Union during this time was the appointment of a new communist leader for Poland. Władysław Gomułka was the people's choice in Poland and also approved of by the Soviets, making the situation a win-win for Eastern communists. When the Polish issue was being resolved, a new situation began to flare up in Hungary. In October 1956, a new leader in Hungary was beginning to cause problems for the Soviet Union. A new government was installed by the Hungarian Communist Party and led by Imre Nagy. Nagy sought greater independence for Hungary. Some of his goals included getting the Soviet troops withdrawn and creating a new neutral Hungary. What was even more shocking and detrimental to Soviet power was Nagy's desire to withdraw his nation from the Warsaw Pact. Soviet troops invaded Hungary in November and deposed of Nagy, thus replacing him with their own chosen candidate as premier. The pressure for more Eastern independence, however, did not die with Nagy. Even though Khrushchev had denounced Stalinism, the Soviet Union was still largely intolerant of independence. 1962 was a rather explosive year for the Soviet Union, or rather it would have been, if Khrushchev followed through with escalating the Cuban Missile Crisis. Once the Cuban dictatorship of Batista was overthrown, Fidel Castro established himself as dictator and created a communist government. In 1962, Cuba began receiving missile shipments from the Soviet Union. This alarmed the United States, and rightfully so, because suddenly the Cold War was right in their backyard. President Kennedy issued a blockade on Cuba to stop new missiles from coming in. An extremely tense week followed where threats and hateful statements were exchanged between the U.S. and Soviet Union. These threats appeared hollow, however, since the Soviet Union stepped down and the crisis ended. Other communist nations began to think of Khrushchev and the Soviet Union as weak and unable to protect them from Western and democratic forces. War was avoided between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the two nations entered a nuclear test ban treaty. Tensions lessened between them, but only increased between the Soviet Union and its communist counterparts. Did Khrushchev take on too much, too quickly? That's what it seemed like to the Eastern world, and Khrushchev, a severely weakened man, stepped down in 1964. And now here to talk about Germany after the Cold War is reporter Max Dunsavage. Welcome, Max.
Thank you for having me. So, in Germany, the former superpower is broken up into West and East. The East is controlled by Russia and is now called the German Democratic Republic, or GDR. And the West, controlled by America, is the German Federal Republic, or GFR. The German Federal Republic owns half of Berlin, even though it falls well under the Democratic Republic side. Russia dismantled the industry in the East, making the German people reliant on Russia and their communist leaders, while America made the West self-sufficient and to ward off communism, promote capitalism, and save American money in the long run. In Berlin, the Western money is spreading more rapidly than the Eastern money, causing the Soviets to blockade Berlin out of fear that the capitalists are gaining too much strength in Germany. The Americans are responding with airlifts into Berlin, where they are dropping supplies to help the people. They are trying to make the people not be forced into communism. This is wearing down the Soviets, and it looks like they'll have to stop the blockade soon. In other news, in East Germany, many intellectuals are leaving to go to the West Germany because they are unhappy with the way of life in the East. This is now being referred to as the brain drain. The brain drain is just another reason the Soviets put up the Berlin Wall and did not allow people to move west. Many people are dying trying to cross the border to the West in attempts to reunite with family or just find better lives. The Christian capitalist West, sponsored by the Americans, and the atheist communist East were at odds, not because of the people in those parts, but they are caught in the crossfire of these two rival nations who are trying to slow down the spread of each other.
Now, Max, wasn't it the Germans who invented the rocket around this time?
Yes, and they influenced the space race, which is going on between Russia and America.
Now, while you were talking about East Germany, I kept thinking of how humiliating it must have been, because everything that Russia tried was just being rejected, and it made the West seem more popular.
The West was more popular in many ways because America was helping them while Russia was holding them down.
Indeed, which probably led to the weakening of the Soviet Union.
Yes, it did.
Thank you for joining us. Good night, folks. Can we do that again? And let's go. I'm going to address the purges of the 1930s as crimes against social injustice. While this seemed to be like the world... I said crimes against injustice. Nikita Khrushchev, because... I was going to say because...